The Lord of the Rings is one of the best-selling books ever written. It's sold over 150 million copies, and in numerous polls, it has been voted as not only the best book of the past century, but even the best book of the past millennium in a 1999 Amazon.com poll. However, few people know that the author of The Lord of the Rings, J.R.R. Tolkien, was an ardent, devoted Catholic. Holly Ordway has written a fascinating new volume titled Tolkien's Faith, a Spiritual Biography, which shows how Tolkien's faith and his fiction were related, although in subtle, complex, and interesting ways. This long overdue spiritual biography gives new insight into his works by shedding fresh light on their author's deepest held convictions. Holly joins us today. Holly is the Cardinal Francis George Professor of Faith and Culture at the Word on Fire Institute. She's also a visiting professor at Houston Christian University and holds a PhD in English from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Holly is a subject editor for the Journal of Inklings Studies, and her academic work focuses especially on the writings of the Inklings and more especially on C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. She's the author of multiple books, including one recently published by Word on Fire titled Tolkien's Modern Reading, Middle-earth Beyond the Middle Ages. That book won the prestigious 2022 Mythopoeic Award for Inkling Studies. And most recently, Tolkien's Faith, a Spiritual Biography, which is the brand new book we'll be discussing today. Holly, it's good to be with you, as always.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be talking to you, Brandon.
Well, let's start with a good initial question for any author of any book. Why this book? What prompted it?
Well, there's sort of an immediate cause and a longer-term cause. The immediate cause was that 2023 marks the 50th anniversary of Tolkien's death. And so that gave a bit of an impetus to thinking about his life as a whole and what's significant about it and what do we need to say that hasn't, already been said. And as I thought about, the research that I've done on Tolkien, I realized that, I knew that he was a Catholic, that he was a serious Christian. But as I look around at the biographies and at the scholarship on him, I realized that although many of the biographies will acknowledge that he was a Catholic, for instance, Humphrey Carpenter, says that he was a devout Catholic and notes its importance in his life. But Carpenter, for instance, attributes it mainly to an attachment to his mother. And doesn't really trace through what it means in his life overall or how he might have lived it out. And then other biographers, like there's one biographer, Raymond Edwards, who writes a very good biography of Tolkien, but literally treats his Catholic faith in an appendix. Talk about compartmentalization. And I realized that there simply was no treatment of him that considered his faith biographically and narratively. And then I realized that I was in a bit of a unique place to do this work, because in researching his life for Tolkien's Modern Reading, I delved really deeply into letters and interviews and recollections to track down what books he'd read. Along the way, I turned up lots of really interesting material about the practice of his faith and how often he spoke of it, how directly he spoke of it. I'm a Catholic, a devout Roman Catholic. In letters, in public interviews, in the recollection of his family and his friends. And of course, that didn't belong in Tolkien's Modern Reading because that was an academic, literary, critical study. But I had this growing pile of notes about his faith and how he lived it. And I also began to realize that there had been no exploration, really, of any detail of his immediate context as an English Catholic grounded in 20th century England, and specifically in two locations, Oxford and Birmingham. And over the past more than a decade now, more like 15 years, I've spent a lot of time every year in Oxford. I've been to Birmingham as well. I've worked in the Bodleian Library. I've worshipped in the churches where Tolkien worshipped. At St. Gregory and St. Augustine, I actually sit typically in the very pew that Tolkien sat in. And so I began to realize that there were all these nuances and textures that come specifically from English Catholicism that most American Catholics, and certainly most American readers, don't even know that they don't know, and that I had managed to get an acquaintance with. And I thought, I want to bring this forward. I want to be a guide to readers of Tolkien. And so Tolkien's Faith emerged as a way to really to guide readers into this aspect of Tolkien's life that has really not been treated in depth. And there's so much more depth there that people don't even know is there.
I think, Holly, that many Catholics reading this book will recognize elements of Tolkien's spiritual life, things like Mass, confession, the Rosary, feast days, Eucharistic processions. There's also a fascinating part of your book where you show how Tolkien reflected on the changes coming in the wake of the Second Vatican Council, particularly in regards to the liturgy. But your book is not just for Catholics. It has a very expansive, broad interest. And I'm wondering what you think non-Catholics are likely to get from this book. What do you think non-Catholics miss or at least neglect about Tolkien's faith?
Well, I think they miss a lot of what Sidley he was talking about. I mean, if you read the letters, for instance, he's repeatedly saying things like about the Eucharist, about prayer, about Mary. And there's absolutely no reason for someone who's not a Catholic or not a Christian to have any idea what he's talking about. What does he mean when he says he talks about the Eucharist being the one great thing to love on earth? What does he mean when he talks about the Blessed Mother or about the Assumption or the Ascension? And these are things that Tolkien had so internalized that he took them as a given. They were part of his life, part of the foundational elements of his creative imagination. And so they're really useful and important for understanding his writings, the themes he explores, understanding what motivated him as a creative artist, what shaped him. And there's no way that anyone can know this unless someone explains it to them. And so I have really tried to do that. And I say right away in the introduction that although I share his faith, I'm a Catholic, but I am not presenting this book from that perspective. My aim is to be a guide, neither to critique his faith nor to recommend it. I just want to show the reader this is what was important to Tolkien. This is what these words meant. And there are many instances in Tolkien's faith where, for instance, I can pull out and say, this phrase he uses is actually a scriptural reference. And here's the additional meaning that it has because it comes from this. And I want to just serve as a guide so that people can have that extra level of detail and depth. And so I really want to encourage any readers who, maybe they might be a little bit hesitant, like, I'm not a Christian. Is this book for me? Yes, it is for you. There's even a glossary at the end. I don't expect you to know anything. You can look it up in the glossary if you don't know what the terms are.
Tolkien's life was marked from nearly the very beginning by significant suffering. He lost his father when he was 4 years old. Then he lost his mother when he was 12 years old, became an orphan, was taken in by this heroic priest, Father Francis Morgan. But even at that point, he was still suffering under difficulties as a Catholic in a predominantly Protestant country. Most of his family was still Catholic. Catholics were persecuted at that time and place. How did all of these difficulties and sufferings shape his faith?
Well, I think the early sufferings that he had, which were great. I mean, to be an orphan, to have lost both parents by age 12, and to be estranged at that point from your grandparents and your uncles and aunts because they're Protestants and they're very angry at your family being Catholic, that gave him a lot to deal with as a young man that he works through in large part because of the loving guidance of Father Francis, whom Tolkien says taught him forgiveness. He showed him how to forgive. And so he managed to emerge from that. And a really startling thing is that he ends up building healthy, loving relationships with his extended family. They're still Protestants, he's still Catholic, and yet he ends up spending a lot of time with them and having friendships with them. And so right away we can see already that his suffering is, teaching him that he has to grapple with it. He can't just hide away from what's difficult. He has to face it and to forge these relationships to forgive. And that's a really helpful, healthy, emotional thing to be able to do. And of course, then he goes into the Great War. He fights in the trenches of the Great War as a lieutenant and sees tremendous suffering and pain. And that's a cataclysm in which many of the people of his generation they confronted the problem of evil and they lost their faith. They thought, how can God exist in this situation? But Tolkien didn't lose his faith. He came through it, still faithful, still believing. And I think that indicates that he had, in a sense, developed some real spiritual muscle before he even got into the trenches. The idea that God might permit great sorrow and great difficulty was something he had already encountered and been able to assimilate. And I think that helped him to get through it. And I think that ends up showing some indication of how The Lord of the Rings has such depth to it, because that book has a lot of suffering in it, and he treats it very seriously. I think one of the most moving parts of The Lord of the Rings for me is the fact that Frodo, he completes the quest. I mean, he fails at the end, but providentially, the quest is completed at any rate. He's physically healed of his wounds. He's back in the Shire. But the wounds he's received, the weight of carrying the ring, the wound from the ring wraith, he's still hurting from that. And one of the most sort of painful lines is when Frodo says, Sam, yes, the Shire has been saved, but not for me. And that just touches me every time, because this is Tolkien who has been through sorrow and suffering, and he's faithful, but he knows that in this life, not all of the wounds are going to be healed. And that sort of spiritual realism comes into The Lord of the Rings, and I think that's part of what makes it so powerful.
One of the connections that you do a great job drawing out in your book is between J.R.R. Tolkien and John Henry Newman. Newman will be a name familiar to a lot of Catholics and especially Word on Fire followers. He's one of our great patrons. But after Tolkien's parents died, he and his brother were effectively adopted by a Catholic priest, Father Francis Morgan. Morgan was a friend and mentee of John Henry Newman. If I'm not mistaken, I think in your book it describes him as serving as a secretary of Newman's for a period of time. Newman, probably the most famous English theologian and saint of the last couple hundred years. He lived at and established the Birmingham Oratory. You alluded to that earlier, which is this spiritual community that was marked by Newman's spirituality and kind of the second home for Tolkien himself. So Tolkien's whole upbringing was marked by Newman's influence. Can you talk a little bit more about how Newman shaped Tolkien's faith?
Well, I think the major way is that Newman brought the congregation of the Oratory of St. Philip Neri to England. He founded the Birmingham Oratory. And so therefore, the spirituality of St. Philip Neri was the spirituality in which Tolkien grew up and was formed. And that's a aspect of Tolkien's faith that I explore in quite a lot of detail in the book, and something that has really not been explored, the way that this oratory and spirituality had such a shaping effect on Tolkien's life. But another aspect of that that's a little bit more directly connected to Newman is that Newman was himself, he was himself a convert, of course, and so the Birmingham Oratory was filled with, Tolkien said, learned fathers, many of them converts. So again, he grew up in an environment that Newman had brought together, in which there were lots of Catholic priests who had been Anglicans, who understood the two worlds, who understood how to help Tolkien's mother Mabel and Tolkien himself and his brother Hilary, how to help them make that transition. And they also weren't scared of Protestants. They weren't hiding away in a little enclave and saying, oh, we're just going to do our Catholic thing. They recognized these are fellow Christians, and we aren't afraid of that, and we're going to be able to mingle and interact with them. And another aspect that Newman brought to this environment that was so formative for Tolkien was a real emphasis on education. Because one of the reasons Newman chose the congregation of the Oratory of St. Philip Neri as the order he would found was that it placed a lot of education, a lot of emphasis on education, on the arts, on music, on learning. And so Tolkien was able to grow up in an environment where the idea of using your intellectual gifts was supported and it was encouraged. And for a young man of such talent as Tolkien, with so little money and such sort of difficult situation, that was really the situation that he needed to flourish, because he could easily, in a different context, have been shunted off to, well, you're going to get apprenticed to, a bank teller so that you can actually earn a living and maybe you can write some poetry in your spare time, right? But instead, the Newman community as a whole, and Father Francis Morgan in particular, support his education. And that leads him to go into Oxford and to become the world-class scholar that he became. And that's one of the things that I think we benefit from this sort of deep dive into his faith, because we see that the faith environment that he was raised in had massive effects. It wasn't just his internal spirituality. I mean, the very fact that J.R.R. Tolkien became, the Merton, professor that he was in his career, the Pembroke and Merton, the fact that he was this famous academic and produced The Lord of the Rings out of all this learning and scholarship. Well, I think we can really trace a lot of that to the fact that the Oratorian fathers thought, yes, this is a good thing for our young man to do.
Another thing you highlight in the book is the extraordinary number of prayers and scripture passages that Tolkien committed to memory. In fact, you see this when you read his letters especially, but also some of his fiction work where biblical language seems to just roll effortlessly from his pen. Why was this so important for him to store all of this religious language in his mind?
Well, I think to begin with, it was just simply natural to him. He had an absolutely prodigious memory. And so I think that he stored all of these things almost without consciously trying to. And so it came naturally to him. I mean, he even memorized the entire canon of the Mass, which is quite a substantial chunk of the liturgy. And as well as he holds some whole psalms and many other prayers. And of course, he mentions the memorizing the canon of the Mass in his letters. But I realized that how many readers of the letters actually know what that is, other than being part of the liturgy. So in the appendix, one of the appendices, I have two appendices, and I hope the presser would be proud of me. I wrote this book with two appendices. I have an appendix of prayers and liturgical extracts in which I include extracts that we know for certain that Tolkien knew. And I put then the whole canon of the Mass as he would have known it in 1913, 1916, during those formative years, so that you can actually look at that and see this is what he had in his memory. This is the language. This is the prayerful content. And he mentioned in his letters, to one of his sons, that a benefit of having prayers memorized, because he does recommend it. He recommends having especially, prayers of praise memorized, because it allows him, he says, at any moment to be able to offer prayer. And I like that. I like that recognition that, Tolkien, the great linguist, the great creative artist, obviously he would have had extemporaneous prayer as well. But he also liked to have kind of in his back pocket, like at any moment, he could just call upon the beautiful language that he knew, from the liturgy or from the Bible, to be able to pray anytime.
Tolkien had a special devotion to St. John, the evangelist, the writer of the Gospel of John. And in your book, I was struck by your observation that the prologue to the Gospel of John, in the beginning was the Word, that was heard by Tolkien more than probably any other passage in Scripture, because at the end of every Mass up through the 1960s, that was proclaimed. So this was a passage Tolkien would have been deeply familiar with and indeed talks about it often in his letters as well. How did the Gospel of John shape Tolkien's heart and his writings?
Well, the whole Gospel of John is full of beautiful imagery. I mean, that beginning. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and we have this whole creation imagery. And of course, for Tolkien, the Word was preeminent in his life. He had the Word of God spoken in the Scriptures, the Word of God incarnate, Jesus Christ himself, and then lowercase w, words, was what he worked with. It was his delight. That was his passion and his joy. He could almost taste them. And so that connection between the words that he worked with on an everyday level, realizing that they also had a spiritual significance, that, the word was spoken by God, I think would have had a particular resonance for Tolkien. And And I think we can also capture some of that echo of, the creation language in the fact that he writes a creation story in the Silmarillion, and he chooses to retell the creation of the world. In the Silmarillion, he does it through music rather than through language. But I think it's not a coincidence that he heard this passage proclaimed so many times it would have been in his blood. He certainly would have had it memorized, being Tolkien, and he chooses then to creatively respond to it. And among other influences, in his poetic retelling of it in the world of Middle-earth.
As you show in your book, Tolkien had a profound devotion to the Eucharist, the Blessed Sacrament, which Tolkien described as, quote, the one great thing to love on earth. Can you talk a little bit about that?
And this is something I'm glad I was able to unpack in Tolkien's Faith, because the idea of the Last Supper and the giving of the Eucharist, the idea of the Lord's Supper as something important for Christians, is pretty common amongst Christians, but varies a lot. If you are a Baptist, you're going to have a very different understanding of what communion means than if you are a Lutheran, an Anglican, a Catholic. And so one of the things I wanted to do was just to help readers to understand, well, what did Tolkien mean by this? And what he meant by it was, the Catholic teaching that the Blessed Sacraments, the Eucharist, is really the real presence of Christ in the sacrament, his body, his blood, his soul, and divinity present sacramentally there. So it's not just a symbol to him, it's something real. And that gives me a whole chapter to develop what it was that Tolkien felt about that. So this was really a key factor of his spirituality. He had a very Eucharistic spirituality. It was what he said was the one great thing, the most important thing to love on earth, because it's Christ actually present, whom he could encounter. And he always felt that presence. There's a time after his demobilization, when he's working at Leeds for a few years, we don't know quite how long, but for a stretch of years, he even says, I almost ceased to practice my religion. He goes through a real slump in his spiritual life. He says, I almost ceased. He doesn't quite abandon it, but it's a really low ebb. And through that, he says that he felt that there was this hunger, this spiritual hunger, and he felt the silent call of Christ in the sacrament from the tabernacle. And so I think that speaks volumes to just how important the Eucharist was to Tolkien, that even at a low ebb in his spiritual life, he was still aware, this is calling me. I can't quite answer for whatever reason, but I feel this hunger and this call.
Tolkien coined the term Eucatastrophe, and he used that to describe the climactic moment in a fairy tale where the characters experience a happy and unexpected turn of events. But what's interesting, you pull this out in your book, is how this idea of Eucatastrophe unlocked for Tolkien a new understanding of both scripture and salvation history. Talk about that.
Well, really, I would say that it was his understanding of salvation history that led to his understanding of Eucatastrophe. Because Eucatastrophe, it's a word he invents, because that's the sort of thing he did. It means the good catastrophe. And that's a bit of a strange concept, because a catastrophe is something shattering and disruptive. It's a bad thing, right? But the good catastrophe, Tolkien says, is that happy ending that comes after you think all has been lost. And the sort of climactic Eucatastrophe in The Lord of the Rings is when the quest has been completed, the ring has been thrown into the fire, and Frodo and Sam are there on Mount Doom at the end of all things. And they just collapse out of fatigue and despair and exhaustion. And we think all is lost. But then they are rescued. The eagles come and pick them up, and they awake in safety. And that's the prime eucatastrophic moments in The Lord of the Rings. And of course, we get other ones, when we have a eucatastrophic moment in The Hobbit, when again the eagles come and break the stalemate of the Battle of Five Armies. So for Tolkien, he explores why do we long for this happy ending? Why do we have a desire for it? And he says in his great essay on fairy stories that it's because this is really true of cosmic history. He says that the incarnation of Christ is the Eucatastrophe of human history. It's the unexpected happy ending that God would come down to meet us in our sinfulness. And then he says the resurrection is the Eucatastrophe of the story of the incarnation, because that story ends in what looks like disaster. Jesus is crucified, his disciples all run away, it's all over, but then we have the resurrection, the utterly unexpected happy ending. And since Tolkien believed that these were both mythic events in the sense that they were powerful stories and that they really happened in history, that they were what Lewis later calls true myth, because of that, he believes that there's a sort of a cosmic echo of that happy ending in the world. And so therefore, when we are responding to the happy ending in a story, we actually are in some way responding to the cosmic happy ending of the resurrection of Christ. Now, obviously, for a non-Christian, reading Tolkien's thoughts on this, they're going to say, well, I don't believe in the incarnation, so what does this mean to me? But what I want to tease out in Tolkien's faith is that if we understand that this is Tolkien's understanding, then we can see that for him, the happy ending after great sorrow and pain is not just a literary conceit. It's actually tapping into his deepest beliefs, and it has all sorts of resonances with scripture and with other literature that since we see the connection, we can follow those resonances. And then whatever beliefs we may personally have, we can come back to that eucatastrophic scene and say, oh, this is even deeper and more powerful than I thought it was.
You have a fascinating section on Tolkien as evangelist in the book. It's not a major part of the text, but an interesting part where you look at how Tolkien personally shared his faith with various people, seekers, skeptics, fallen away Catholics. Talk about how Tolkien shared his faith outside of his writings.
Yeah, this is a great question because as you noted, we don't typically think of him as doing that because in his public writings and his public speaking, he confined himself to literary topics because he was, taking the approach that, let the theologians talk about theology publicly. But of course, as a Catholic, as a Christian, he would have, heard the great, the Great Commission: go and make disciples, share the faith. You need to be telling people about the gospel. So I thought to myself, well, do we have any evidence that he did that personally? And certainly we do see that he's very public as a Catholic, so people knew that he was a Catholic and therefore could maybe approach him and ask him questions and talk to him. And we have, for instance, examples of that. Robert Murray, a young friend of his, was drawn to him and eventually himself became a priest. But what I found particularly interesting was digging down deeply and finding that when he had a relationship, a personal friendship with someone who was not a Catholic, he was open to talking about it. He was not pushy. He was absolutely gentle and respectful. And so it almost can go under the radar, but it was definitely there. So for instance, he had a great conversation by letter with Warnie Lewis, the brother of C.S. Lewis. Warnie was in a hospital. Lewis had written to him, and because Warnie was in actually a Catholic hospital, some topics about the faith came up, and they ended up having a really interesting conversation by letter, talking about the Virgin Mary and different views on that. And of course, Warnie never became a Catholic, but one of the effects of that conversation was that Warnie began to see that, okay, these weird Catholic beliefs are actually not quite as outlandish as he might have thought, and he ends up having a slightly more nuanced view of the faith, and that is a significant accomplishment. So we see that a lot of times where he takes a little opening and he's willing to talk about the faith, and he's not trying to push them into the church, but he's there and he's sharing his faith in a relational way.
I think anyone interested in Tolkien or Lord of the Rings will find your book really interesting, fascinating, and in fact, even edifying. I told you that when I finished reading the book, I just felt that I knew Tolkien as a person, not just as a historical figure, but I knew him at a much deeper, more intimate level. But still, I think the underlying question for most readers is still going to be, okay, how did Tolkien's faith shape his writings? His writings are the main thing. So how would you answer that? How did Tolkien's Catholic faith shape his fiction?
Well, I think to answer that, we might go back to one of the most famous statements that he ever made about the Lord of the Rings. It's often been quoted. He said, and I'll do this from memory, he said, "The Lord of the Rings is a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously in the draft, but consciously in the revision," which is a pretty strong statement. But then he confuses everybody because the very next sentence he says, "That is why I have cut out almost all references to religion." Wait, what? It's fundamentally Catholic, and that's why I've cut out all the Catholic bits. And I think what we want to carry on just a little bit more, because then he says the religious element is absorbed in the story and the symbolism. And that's where understanding his faith really helps us. We have it by his own account, and not just in this one letter, but in many places, that his writings, The Lord of the Rings, and all of his fiction was fundamentally religious and Catholic. That means, he was a linguist. He knew what the connotations were. At the fundament, at the basis, at the roots, is fundamentally religious and Catholic. So that means that what comes out of it, what is coming from it, is going to be infused with his faith in really subtle and nuanced ways. And it's not going to be as direct as, this is an allegory of the Gospels. He is crystal clear, and rightly so, that the Lord of the Rings is not an allegory. He says it's about nothing but itself. So we don't want to go there, and because that wouldn't be accurate. But it is fundamentally Christian, and in the story and the symbolism. And so I think that if we understand his faith, we'll be able to recognize where the story does have those Christian resonances. We've already talked about the way that the happy ending, the Eucatastrophic turn, has a very deep Christian resonance for him. That would be an example of a story having that fundamentally Christian element. Or even the fact that the eagles come to rescue him. St. John, the evangelist, one of his most important patrons, has as his symbol the eagle. So for Tolkien to have the eagles coming to rescue them at the Eucatastrophic moment is symbolically resonant of St. John the Evangelist, who wrote the fourth gospel and wrote "The Word was made flesh," which gives a marvelous sort of sense of sacramentality and sacredness to these eagles. They really could not be anything else. Frodo and Sam could not have been rescued by vultures. Had to be eagles, right? And I think if we understand that, the symbolism, we haven't even touched on the way that the lembas, it has this Eucharistic resonance. That's the way that his faith is infused into his work. And it also shapes just his approach to creation, because his whole idea of creativity is fundamentally influenced by the belief that he himself has been made, as he's made in the image of a maker. God, the creative artist, has made him, J.R.R. Tolkien, and therefore when he is creating, his whole idea of sub-creation, the secondary creation, derives from his Christian beliefs about primary creation. And so these are the subtle resonances that we see. And one of the delights of writing Tolkien's Faith has been that it has actually helped me to appreciate Tolkien's writings even more. And, not every literary research project does that. Sometimes you finish a project and you think, okay, that just killed it for me. But this has been the opposite, because now when I open up The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit or any of his writings, I feel like I'm noticing a greater depth and texture and savoring it more, like a whole bunch of new flavors that have come into the story. And that, I think, is the main benefit from understanding this fundamental. And I hope that Tolkien's Faith ends up being an invitation to taste those flavors and to enjoy those depths, so that people will, read Tolkien's Faith and then read Tolkien's writings and enjoy them even more.
I expect that will be the result for all readers of this groundbreaking new book. Again, it's titled Tolkien's Faith, A Spiritual Biography by Holly Ordway. You can get your copy at Word on Fire or from anywhere great books are sold. Holly, thanks so much for joining us and for sharing all this info about J.R.R. Tolkien.
My pleasure.
And thank you for watching and listening, and we'll see you next time here at Word on Fire.